Fannie Mae Chambers was a woman tied directly to the founders of Chicago's Four Corner Hustlers, who drove Interstate 55 back and forth between the west side of Chicago and Mississippi, moving drugs and teaching teenagers in Canton how to run a professional drug market. She became the operational link between one of Chicago's most structured street gangs and the small Mississippi city that would become its first out-of-state headquarters. This is the story of one woman, one highway, and what she built for the Four Corner Hustlers in a state 500 miles from where they started. Before we get to Fannie Mae Chambers, we have to understand what she was plugged into and why her role only made sense inside a machine that had already been running for over a decade. The Four Corner Hustlers were founded in 1968 in the West Garfield Park neighborhood of Chicago by Walter Wheat and Fred Gage Jr. They were not formed as a drug gang, they were formed as a protection crew, a group of young men who wanted to hold a specific set of corners in a changing neighborhood and defend their people from other gangs that were preying on the community. The territory was narrow. A Chicago Tribune report from 1994 described the original Four Corner Hustlers as representing just 6 square blocks on the west side. 6 blocks. Walter Wheat ran that organization with rules most people in the street gang world would consider extreme. No drug use, no drug dealing, no mugging, no burglarizing, and no drinking to the point of intoxication. The founding concept was discipline, a word that would follow this gang through every chapter of its history, even when the men who lived by it were gone. Both Wheat and Gage came from what the streets call a royal bloodline, a vice lord lineage that traced the family back to Chicago's original vice lord founders in the 1940s. Fred Gage Jr.'s father, Fred Gage Sr., also known as Alfred Gage Jr., was a co-founder of the original Vice Lords and a founder of the Executioner Vice Lords. Walter Wheat was related to the Gage family by blood. These were not 2 random West Side teenagers who decided to name a crew. They were the sons and nephews of men who had built the foundation of Chicago's Vice Lord Nation from the ground up. The founding took shape at Delano Playground at the corner of Springfield and Wilcox. The first members included Fred Gage Jr., Walter Wheat, Larry Ford, Richard Left Hand Goodman, and Marvin Evans, young men who looked up to Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton, Huey Newton, Marcus Garvey, and Thurgood Marshall. The organization they built was supposed to stand against the destruction happening in their neighborhood. The drugs being pushed in, the crooked landlords, the crooked police. That was 1968. The Chicago streets of that year were not gentle, and neither was the trajectory of the men who built the Four Corner Hustlers inside them. By the mid-1970s, both founders were in prison. Fred Gage Jr. went to prison in 1972 after a shooting at a Valentine's Day dance at Presentation Catholic Church, where Officer Henderson Arnold was shot 3 times during a confrontation that also involved Four Corner Hustler Leo Walker. Gage was sentenced to 10 years for attempted murder of a police officer. Walter Wheat was imprisoned in 1975 on aggravated assault charges and would spend over 10 years behind bars. With both founders gone from the streets, the rules started to bend. By the time a Chicago police officer named John Nee testified in a 1993 court case that he had been watching Four Corner Hustler drug operations around Madison and Menard for 18 years. That timeline put the start of their drug trafficking at roughly 1975. The same year Walter Wheat disappeared into prison. The no-drug rule had not survived the absence of the man who created it. The connection between the Four Corner Hustlers and Mississippi was set in motion in 1981, not through some formal organizational decision, but through one person. A young man from Canton, Mississippi named Percy Squinky Walker had spent time in Chicago's Austin neighborhood, learning the McAteer Four Corner Hustler operation from the inside. He came back to Canton with everything he had absorbed and introduced the Four Corner Hustlers to his city. Canton, Mississippi was a struggling place. Poverty, racial tension, limited economic opportunity, and the kind of isolation that makes young men hungry for any structure that promises belonging and money. Squinky Walker offered both. Canton became the first city outside of the Midwest to have Four Corner Hustlers, and according to street history, it became the capital of the Four Corner Hustlers in Mississippi. Squinky Walker died in April 1985 from a shotgun wound at 19 years old. But before that happened, something important had already been set in place, not just by Squinky Walker, but by the woman who had been driving down to Mississippi to make sure his operation grew into something that could last without him. That woman was Fannie Mae Chambers. Fannie Mae Chambers was a female member of the Four Corner Hustlers connected directly to Walter Wheat and Fred Gage Jr. She was also related to Squinky Walker. That combination, blood ties to the Chicago leadership and family ties to the Canton founder, placed her at the only intersection in this whole story that mattered. The point where Chicago and Mississippi actually touched. She was the teacher, and the road she taught on was Interstate 55. What she taught, who she taught it to, and what grew from that instruction across 3 decades in a state 500 miles from Chicago's west side. That is what this story is about, the bloodline and the blueprint. To understand why Fannie Mae Chambers was trusted with what she was trusted with, you have to understand the kind of organization she was part of. The internal culture, the hierarchy, and the almost obsessive emphasis on loyalty that ran through the Four Corner Hustlers from the very beginning. Street organizations that survive, that grow beyond one neighborhood, that outlast the deaths and imprisonments of their founders, that replicate themselves in cities and states far from where they started, do not do so by accident. They survive because somewhere in their structure there is a set of values that functions as an operating system, something that determines who is trusted, what the rules are, and what happens when those rules are broken. The Four Corner Hustlers had that, and it came directly from their founding bloodline. Fred Gage Sr. was not just any Vice Lord. He was a co-founder of the original Vice Lords, the Executioner Vice Lords, and the co-founder of the Lords of Islam Phantom Motorcycle Club. The lineage his son Fred Gage Jr. carried into the Four Corner Hustlers was one of the deepest in West Side Chicago gang history, and Walter Wheat, who was related to the Gage family by blood, carried the same inheritance. When the Four Corner Hustlers came together in 1968, they did not just come together as teenagers building a crew. They came together as the sons of men who had built the Vice Lord Nation, and they understood, at a foundational level, what it meant to construct something designed to endure. The Four Corner Hustlers were not the only gang to come out of West Garfield Park in 1968. That same year, a group called the Gents formed at Gladys and Keeler, and they would shortly become the Supreme Gangsters, an early branch of what would eventually be the Gangster Disciples. The entire architecture of Chicago gang culture was being written in West Garfield Park that year by young men who were responding to a neighborhood in the middle of racial transition. White flight stripping away economic stability and leaving behind a community that felt abandoned by every institution designed to protect it. The Four Corner Hustlers emerged out of that specific moment, not as a symptom of the destruction around them, but in Wheat's original vision as a defiant answer to it. West Garfield Park in those years was not simply a neighborhood that happened to produce gangs. It was a neighborhood that had been systematically stripped of the economic and institutional buffers that prevent young men from organizing around violence and criminality. The construction of the Dan Ryan Expressway in the late 1950s had already accelerated the displacement of Black Chicago's middle class, destabilizing communities across the West Side. By the early 1960s, white flight from West Garfield Park had accelerated to the point where the neighborhoods nearest the park emptied first and fastest. By the mid-1960s, K-Town and West Garfield Park, the dense residential corridors that Walter Wheat and Fred Gage Jr. would grow up navigating, had completed its demographic transformation. The African-American middle-class families who had moved in were now themselves beginning to leave, heading further west toward Austin, away from the concentrated poverty that was beginning to take hold around the park. What was left was a community with few resources, collapsing property values, an incoming flood of cheap heroin that the Italian mafia and other criminal organizations were pushing into the neighborhood, and no meaningful institutional response to any of it. Into that specific vacuum stepped Walter Wheat and Fred Gage Jr., and because of who their family was, they stepped in with authority. Willie Lloyd, a cousin of both Wheat and Gage, was granted his own Vice Lord group in 1967 with direct blessing from the Vice Lord leadership, which he named the Unknown Vice Lords, operating out of East Garfield Park's Fifth City area. The founding of the Four Corner Hustlers a year later put both parts of the family on opposite sides of Garfield Park. Wheat and Gage holding the West Garfield Park corners, Lloyd holding East Garfield Park through the Unknown Vice Lords. The entire geography was a family operation, and the bloodline logic that governed who held which territory was as deliberate as any corporate expansion strategy. When the Four Corner Hustlers were fully established in 1968, Walter Wheat became the chief, while Fred Gage Jr. was given the title of king. Willie Lloyd was furious enough about the formal independence of the Four Corner Hustlers to declare 40 days of war against them. That conflict, between family members who were also rival gang leaders, captures something essential about how the Four Corner Hustlers operated from the beginning. Inside a web of blood relationships where loyalty and rivalry coexisted in the same people, and where the bonds of kinship were both the organization's greatest strength and the source of its most complex internal tensions. Those tensions would resurface across every chapter of the Four Corner Hustlers' history. They would resurface when Monroe Banks broke from the Vice Lord Alliance in 1987, in part because of a personal dispute with Willie Lloyd. They would resurface when Angelo Roberts took over the organization and the boundaries of loyalty were redrawn around him. And they are essential to understanding Fannie Mae Chambers because her position inside that web of kinship is precisely what gave her the role she occupied. She was not a peripheral figure who happened to be connected to the right people. She was embedded in the founding bloodline itself, connected to Wheat, connected to Gage, connected to the Canton founder Squinky Walker through family. In an organization where family ties determined everything about who could be trusted with what, that positioning was everything. That context matters because it explains the seriousness with which the founding members approached the rules. These were not teenagers playing at organization. They were young men inspired by Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Fred Hampton, Huey Newton, Marcus Garvey, and Thurgood Marshall. Voices of Black power and Black dignity in an era when both were under constant attack. Those were not the inspirations of a crew building a drug business. Those were the inspirations of young men trying to build a counter-institution in a neighborhood that the city of Chicago had already decided to abandon. The discipline Wheat imposed, no drugs, no alcohol, no predatory behavior against their own community, was the entire philosophical point. The Four Corner Hustlers were supposed to stand apart from the destruction. They were supposed to be above it. That original intention is the baseline against which everything that followed, including Fannie Mae Chambers' trips down I-55, has to be measured. The gap between what the Four Corner Hustlers were supposed to be and what they became is wide enough to swallow a generation. By the time Chambers was driving product to Mississippi in the early 1980s, the founding generation was either dead or imprisoned. The rules Walter Wheat had laid down at Delano Playground had not survived the violence, the money, or the prolonged absence of the men who had made them mean something. What survived was the structure, the hierarchy, the bloodline logic, the emphasis on trust and loyalty and discipline within the organization, even as the organization itself had transformed into something its founder never intended. That structural inheritance was both the Four Corner Hustlers' greatest asset and the engine of their most lasting damage. The same discipline that made them effective community protectors in 1968 made them effective drug traffickers in 1982. The same loyalty that had held the organization together through the imprisonment of its founders made it capable of withstanding the deaths of its successors in the 1990s. Structure, once built into an organization, does not disappear when the moral framework around it changes. It persists, and it serves whoever is in charge of directing it. This is the part of the Four Corner Hustler's story that matters most for understanding Fannie Mae Chambers. She was not plugged into a chaotic street crew that happened to move drugs. She was plugged into an organization with a chain of command, a culture of discipline, a system for determining who could be trusted and who could not, and a track record of expanding into new territories by sending trusted people from the founding circles into those territories to establish operations. That is the framework that made her role possible. That is the framework that made her effective. Walter Wheat was released from prison in 1985. 10 years after his 1975 imprisonment, and did not return to the west side of Chicago, but instead moved to Harvey, Illinois, where he established a Four Corner Hustler faction in a public housing development the members nicknamed The Village. Even in his return, Wheat was selective. He chose members carefully. He maintained the discipline that had always defined his leadership, even when the organization he founded had gone in directions he had never intended. That selectivity, the insistence on trust, on bloodline connections, on proven loyalty, is the same selection criterion that had placed Fannie Mae Chambers in her role in the first place. She was trusted because she was family. She was family to Squinky Walker. She was connected to Wheat and Gage. In an organization built on the logic of bloodlines and earned loyalty, that positioning gave her access that no outsider could have purchased or negotiated. She had not worked her way up through a hierarchy of drug sales. She had been placed into her role by the same logic of kinship and trust that had always governed who the Four Corner Hustlers led into their inner circle. When Fannie Mae Chambers arrived in Canton, with the knowledge she carried from Chicago, she was not just delivering a drug supply. She was delivering the structural DNA of an organization that had been built, from its first days to last. The highway and what moved on it. Interstate 55 is 964 miles long, running from the southern edge of Chicago's downtown Lakeshore district down through Springfield and St. Louis, threading through Missouri and Arkansas before ending in Jackson, Mississippi. It has been called many things over the decades. Civil engineers describe it as a federal highway. Historians of Black American migration call it the Northern Corridor. the paved successor to the Illinois Central Railroad that hundreds of thousands of black families rode north out of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee between 1910 and 1970, fleeing the grinding legal brutality of Jim Crow and the economic strangulation of sharecropping for the promise of factory wages and something approaching civic dignity in cities like Chicago, Detroit, Gary, and St. Louis. Chicago's Black West Side was, in significant part, built by people who came up that road or that rail line. The neighborhoods where the Four Corner Hustlers were born, West Garfield Park, East Garfield Park, Austin, were filled with families whose grandparents or great-grandparents had made that journey north. And because families that migrate do not sever every connection to where they came from, the Great Migration created kinship networks between Chicago and Mississippi that never fully broke. Grandmothers in Canton had grandchildren in West Garfield Park. Cousins in Chicago visited cousins in Mississippi during summers. Entire communities existed simultaneously in two geographies, separated by 500 miles of asphalt. Fannie Mae Chambers drove that road. She drove it multiple times in both directions, carrying product from Chicago and returning with money. And she did it in a context where that specific trip, a black woman driving south on I-55, was so common, so embedded in the cultural landscape of the highway that it dissolved into everything around it. That invisibility was not accidental. It was the operational genius at the center of her whole role. Research on the Four Corner Hustlers specifically highlights how children from Chicago who visited Mississippi during summers introduced peers to Chicago gang culture, and how local media in Mississippi routinely dismissed this influence as the behavior of wannabe kids rather than recognizing it as organized expansion. That institutional dismissal, the assumption that Chicago gangs in Mississippi were performance rather than transplant, created cover for the structural work being done to actually establish the Four Corner Hustlers in Canton. And the woman driving the supply along I-55 moved inside that cover with precision. The research describes Chambers as someone who carried herself in a way that commanded respect. She was tall, she dressed well and wore jewelry. She presented as the kind of person who had money, who had standing, who did not belong to the profile of someone law enforcement in 1980 would think to stop and search on a highway in the middle of the night. Back in the 1980s, women were not as suspected of being heavily involved in drug trafficking. That gap between what law enforcement expected and what was actually moving through the cars is exactly what made her effective. Research from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention confirms that early gang studies consistently underestimated women's roles, treating female members as peripheral satellites rather than active operators. By the 1980s, scholars had begun to catch up, acknowledging that women in street organizations often served as couriers, stash house managers, and money handlers precisely because gender stereotypes gave them the cover that men standing on corners simply did not have. But law enforcement had not caught up at the same rate. The federal infrastructure of wiretaps, coordinated task forces, and asset seizure prosecutions that would eventually dismantle organizations like the Four Corner Hustlers was still being built in the early 1980s. The drug war was young, the tactics were blunt, and the gender assumptions were deeply entrenched. Chambers moved in that gap with a kind of operational freedom that would have been impossible for any man from the Chicago organization to replicate. She made multiple trips. Each time she drove that 530-mile stretch of highway, she was not just delivering a package, she was building an institution. The young men Percy Squinky Walker had recruited into the Four Corner Hustlers in Canton were not experienced drug dealers when she arrived. They were teenagers in a struggling Mississippi city who knew about the Four Corner Hustlers because Walker had brought the name, the symbols, and the structure down from the West Side. But knowing the name of an organization and knowing how to run a drug market at the street level are two fundamentally different things. Chambers closed that gap with the kind of direct practical instruction that has always been how criminal enterprises actually train their people, not through manuals or formal curricula, but through one person sitting down with another person and walking them through exactly how the operation works from the ground up. She taught them how to package product, how to price for street-level sales, how to manage supply so the operation stayed consistent rather than spiking and crashing, how to handle cash without making it obvious, how to keep order within the group when disputes arose over money or territory, how to identify risk and manage it before it escalated into the kind of police attention that ends markets prematurely. This was professional curriculum. It was the institutional knowledge of a Chicago street organization that had been operating for over a decade, condensed and delivered in person by someone who carried it directly from the source. The drug economy she was teaching into was itself in the middle of a historic shift. Heroin had dominated Chicago's West Side drug market throughout the 1970s, and it was still the primary product moving through the Four Corner Hustlers' Chicago operations when Chambers was making her early run south. But by 1983 and 1984, crack cocaine was beginning to redefine street-level drug economics across American cities with a velocity that no one had fully anticipated. Sellers who had previously operated in heroin and marijuana markets moved rapidly into crack because it generated faster cash income at the street level, smaller quantities per transaction, lower price per unit, but dramatically higher volume and faster turnover of profit. The economics of crack made it uniquely accessible in a city like Canton. Small, economically distressed, with the population struggling under conditions that had no use for the capital investment required to run a heroin operation at scale. Crack lowered the barrier to entry for both sellers and buyers, and Chambers was teaching these young men how to run a drug business at exactly the moment that the product those markets were being built around was shifting into its most accessible and most explosive form. She was not just teaching the general principles of how to deal drugs. She was teaching a specific model, the Four Corner Hustlers model, at the precise historical moment when that model was about to become exponentially more profitable because of what it was being applied to. The teenagers in Canton who received that instruction were not being introduced to a street hustle. They were being plugged into the opening stages of a national drug crisis with a fully formed operational framework already in hand. The transition from heroin to crack was not simply a product change. It was a complete reorganization of the economic logic of street drug sales. Heroin markets were characterized by relatively stable customer bases, addicts who required consistent supply and returned reliably because their dependency made them predictable. Managing a heroin operation required relationships with supply chains that ran through established networks, often with ties to organized crime structures that controlled importation and wholesale distribution. The barriers to entry were formidable. The knowledge required to run a heroin operation efficiently was sophisticated and hard to acquire outside of established circles that had spent years building those pipelines. Crack broke that logic entirely. It could be manufactured locally from powder cocaine. It required no established importation network. Its customer base grew with terrifying speed because its addictive properties were far more immediate than powder cocaine, creating new addicts faster than heroin ever had. And its price point made it accessible to populations that had never before been part of any hard drug market. The market was enormous, it was accelerating, and it was almost entirely open in cities like Canton, Mississippi, which had never had the organizational infrastructure for sophisticated heroin distribution, but were suddenly positioned to build crack markets that required nothing but disciplined street-level operations and someone who knew how to set them up. That knowledge, the specific operational knowledge of how to structure a drug market, manage personnel, handle supply and revenue, and keep an operation running under pressure, was exactly what Fannie Mae Chambers was carrying down Interstate 55 in a car that looked like it belonged to someone visiting family for the holidays, and in a very real sense it did, because the entire premise of the Chicago to Mississippi pipeline was that it was indistinguishable from the family visits that had been happening along that highway for decades. A woman making the drive from Chicago to Canton was not suspicious, it was ordinary. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, in a corridor that had been built by Black migration and kept alive by Black kinship. The drug pipeline that the Four Corner Hustlers ran along Interstate 55 was not imposed on top of an existing social geography. It was threaded through it, using the same roads, the same family connections, the same rhythms of travel that had defined the relationship between Chicago's West Side and Mississippi since the Great Migration. Fannie Mae Chambers was not operating outside of those rhythms. She was inside them, which is exactly why she was invisible. Back in Chicago, Monroe Banks, who would eventually take over the Four Corner Hustlers after Walter Wheat's continued imprisonment and Fred Gage's death in 1983, pushed the organization decisively into crack cocaine on the West Side. He saw what the gangster disciples were doing with crack on the South Side and recognized that the West Side crack market was wide open. The operation he built, shift managers, street-level dealers, supply runners, revenue collectors, eventually generated revenues that transformed the Four Corner Hustlers from a neighborhood protection crew into a multi-building operation spread across Chicago's public housing. That structure, that chain of command, that division of labor, it was the same structure Chambers was transplanting in Canton. The connection between what was happening in Chicago and what was being built in Mississippi was not philosophical or cultural. It was operational. Same organization, same methods, same hierarchy, same product, transitioning at the same historical moment in both cities from heroin to crack. The Four Corner Hustlers in Canton were not a loose inspiration drawn from Chicago. They were a deliberate extension of the Chicago operation, built using the same blueprint by a woman who had absorbed that blueprint from the inside and had the trust and the family connections to deliver it to a new city. Studies estimated female gang membership at between 8 and 11% nationally during this period, a minority, but one that was performing labor disproportionate to its size precisely because it was performing the labor that nobody was watching for. The women who handled stash houses, managed money, and transported supply were often the most operationally essential people in the network and the least likely to appear in any court record. Fannie Mae Chambers fit that pattern with an exactness that borders on paradigmatic. She was doing the essential work. She was doing it on a major federal highway in a car. She was doing it for years, and she was doing it without leaving a trail that any court or archive has been able to verify. What grew from what she planted when Percy Squinky Walker was killed in April 1985. The Jackson Daily News ran a story alongside a map showing gang territory already spreading outward across central Mississippi. The article described the Canton Gang as one of the most violent in Chicago and misidentified the Four Corner Hustlers as a Southside organization, when in fact they had always operated out of the West Side. But the journalism's core instinct was accurate where it mattered most. Something from Chicago had taken root in Mississippi, and the roots were deep enough to survive the death of the man who had planted them. A caravan of Cadillacs with Illinois license plates arrived in Canton for Squinky's funeral. Chicago had traveled to Mississippi to bury one of its own. That image, a convoy of out-of-state cars sitting in a small Mississippi city for the funeral of a 19-year-old, announced to anyone with the context to read it that this was not an informal association between young men who admired Chicago style. This was an organizational relationship, formalized through years of instruction and supply and shared structure. The Four Corner Hustlers came to Canton for one of their own, because Canton was genuinely theirs. What followed that funeral is the clearest evidence of what Fannie Mae Chambers had actually built. Squinky Walker was the founder. He died at 19, having operated in Canton for only 4 years. If the Canton chapter had been built around him alone, his personal charisma, his specific relationships, his individual authority, it should have dissolved when he died. That is what happens to organizations built around a single indispensable person. They end with that person. Canton did not end. The Four Corner Hustlers there did not collapse, did not splinter into competing crews fighting over a suddenly leaderless operation, did not dissolve back into the unorganized street activity that had preceded Squinky Walker's arrival in 1981. Instead, the organization in Canton absorbed the loss of its founder and continued operating, and then expanded. The fact that a Chicago caravan showed up for the funeral is part of the evidence, but the more important evidence is what happened after the cars from Illinois drove back north. The Four Corner Hustlers in Canton kept running. The markets kept operating. The structure held. That kind of institutional resilience does not emerge from naming a gang and giving young men symbols and colors to identify with. It emerges from the transfer of operational knowledge, the specific, practical, executable knowledge of how a drug market actually functions day to day. Who handles what? How money is collected and accounted for? What happens when supply is disrupted? How disputes within the organization are managed? How pressure from outside the organization, whether from rivals or law enforcement, is absorbed without the whole structure fracturing. Canton did not end. The gang spread from Canton to Columbus, Mississippi, and to Jackson, with Canton remaining the acknowledged capital and headquarters of the Four Corner Hustlers Mississippi operation. The expansion following Walker's death was not the frantic scramble of a group trying to survive a vacuum of leadership. It was the behavior of an organization with enough internal structure and enough trained personnel to absorb a leadership transition and keep moving. The institutional knowledge that Chambers had delivered had taken hold. The teenagers who had sat with her and learned how the operation worked had become the operators. They were now the people doing the teaching. That is how organizational knowledge travels through a street institution across generations, not through manuals or formal training sessions, but through people who learned from someone who knew and passed it on to someone who needed to. Chambers had seeded that transmission. The transmission continued without her. The Canton chapter kept operating because the people she had trained understood the operation well enough to run it themselves and to train the next generation of people who came into it. That chain of transmission, teacher to student to teacher to student, is how street organizations achieve the one thing that individual charisma and individual leadership never can: continuity across the death or imprisonment of any single person. In Chicago, the organization she had been attached to was simultaneously undergoing its most violent and its most transformative decade. Walter Wheat was released from prison in 1985 and moved to Harvey, Illinois, establishing a four-corner hustler faction in a public housing development the members called The Village. He never fully reclaimed the organization. The streets had moved without him, and Monroe Banks had built something in his absence that was harder, more violent, and far more profitable than anything Wheat had originally conceived. Monroe Banks was shot and killed in August 1991 in a dispute that street history ties to friction with the black souls over drug profits. With Banks gone, Wheat briefly resumed leadership before stepping back and endorsing Angelo Roberts, his own son-in-law, to take over. Angelo Roberts officially took over the Four Corner Hustlers in 1992 at 22 years old and launched the most aggressive expansion phase in the gang's history. He converted major sections of Chicago's public housing into Four Corner Hustler territory, the Henry Horner Projects, Rockwell Gardens, Maplewood Courts, and grew the gang's presence into suburbs and neighborhoods it had never previously reached. Under Roberts, the organization fractured into factions: Body Snatchers, Syndicate Fours, Maniac Fours, Angelo's Fours. Each faction had its own territory, its own leadership structure, its own specific drug market to sustain. The Four Corner Hustlers had gone from 6 blocks in West Garfield Park to a multi-city operation with hundreds of members and revenues measured in millions. Walter Wheat himself was shot and killed on July 25, 1994, as he sat in a car on the 3800 block of West Chicago Avenue. He was 43. A 17-year-old four-corner hustler named Bobby Cooley rode up on his car and fired twice, once into his back, once into the back of his head. The man who had written the original rules and spent years in prison for the organization he built was killed by a member of that same organization on one of the same streets where it had started. Bobby Cooley was eventually convicted and sentenced to life. Angelo Roberts was found dead on January 16, 1995, at 70th and Vernon in Greater Grand Crossing with his throat slashed in the back of a car. No one was ever charged. The 2 successive leaders of the Four Corner Hustlers and the founding father himself were all dead within 18 months of each other, and still the organization held in Chicago, in Harvey, in Rockford, in Maywood, in Canton, in Columbus, in Jackson. By 2015, court records in Mississippi confirmed that the Four Corner Hustlers were still actively operating in Canton when a teenage member was sentenced to 40 years in prison for a murder committed there. That court case, more than 30 years after Squinky Walker brought the gang to Canton, and more than 30 years after Fannie Mae Chambers had been making her runs along I-55, is one of the clearest documented confirmations that what was built in Mississippi had endured across 3 decades of leadership changes, deaths, imprisonments, and organizational fractures in Chicago. The Four Corner Hustlers were still in Canton in 2015. The institution was still standing. In Chicago, the federal apparatus that had been building cases against the organization for years was still at work. In May 2022, 10 alleged Four Corner Hustler members and associates were charged federally with running at least 3 open-air drug markets in East Garfield Park, selling cocaine and heroin, some of it laced with fentanyl, for $10 a bag. Investigators using wiretaps, covert surveillance, and undercover narcotics purchases documented the operation's structure in granular detail. A director managing 3 simultaneous markets, shift managers overseeing sales at specific times of day, supply runners picking up narcotics from sources and delivering them to locations, street-level dealers handling individual transactions. A MAC-10 submachine gun and hundreds of rounds of ammunition were recovered. The hierarchy, the chain of command from director down to street-level seller, was a direct institutional descendant of the organizational model the Four Corner Hustlers had been running since the 1970s and had exported to Mississippi in the early 1980s. Then, in April 2026, LeBaron Spahn, a Four Corner Hustler leader, was sentenced to life in federal prison after a jury convicted him on racketeering charges connected to 4 murders, robbery, extortion, and witness tampering. The United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois announced the life sentence, stating that Spahn's organization had terrorized Chicago's West Side for 2 decades through murder, intimidation, and drug dealing. The jury found Spahn had killed 4 men in a premeditated manner as part of the racketeering enterprise. Under federal law, the sentence was mandatory. The organization that Fannie Mae Chambers had helped extend it to Mississippi in the early 1980s was still generating federal life sentences in 2026. The pipeline she helped open had never been fully shut down. Now, the question that any honest account of Fannie Mae Chambers has to address directly is the question of documentation. The most detailed narrative about her role appears on ChicagoGangHistory.com, which provides no citations for the section about her specifically, no newspaper archive, no court record, no federal indictment, no independent source has surfaced to put her name alongside a drug trafficking investigation or a law enforcement case file. Searches for obituaries of women named Fannie Mae Chambers in Mississippi and Indiana turn up accounts of family matriarchs and factory workers, people with no documented Chicago connections or gang ties. This is the part of the story that requires intellectual honesty. The research that documents Chambers' role is careful to label it as street oral history, the kind of account that circulates within communities that experience these events directly, passed down through the people who were there or who knew the people who were there. Oral history is not worthless. In many cases, it is the only record that exists of events that the official documentation apparatus had no interest in recording or no mechanism for capturing. The lives of women who moved drugs along federal highways in the early 1980s did not generate court records. The training sessions that turned Canton teenagers into professional drug dealers were not documented in any federal report. The knowledge that crossed state lines inside a car on Interstate 55 left no paper trail because paper trails were the enemy of the entire operation. The street history that has preserved Fannie Mae Chambers' name is the documentation that exists. It is not the documentation that would satisfy a historian of the traditional school, the kind that requires a primary source and a citation and a corroborating record. But it is the documentation that was available to the communities involved, passed down because people who knew the story understood that it needed to be remembered, even if no official institution was going to do the remembering for them. The honest assessment is this: Fannie Mae Chambers exists in the historical record as a name attached to a specific role in a specific organizational expansion at a specific moment in time. The role is real. Someone performed it. The organizational expansion is real. The Four Corner Hustlers did move into Mississippi. Canton did become their headquarters, and the operation did survive the death of its founder. Whether the specific person attached to that role was precisely the woman described in the oral history, or whether her story has accumulated details over time in the way that all significant street legends accumulate details, is a question the available evidence cannot definitively resolve. The honest assessment is that her story lives in the space between confirmed history and street legend. The Four Corner Hustlers' founding leadership is documented. Squinky Walker's existence and death are confirmed by the Jackson Daily News. The Canton operation's survival past Walker's death is confirmed by the 2015 court case. Interstate 55's role as the primary migration corridor between Mississippi and Chicago is a matter of historical record. The broader presence of women as couriers, trainers, and operational managers in street organizations during this period is documented by federal research. What sits in the unverified space is the specific person: Fannie Mae Chambers, her specific trips, her specific instruction sessions with the young men in Canton. The research is clear-eyed about this. It acknowledges the absence of corroboration and treats her story accordingly. As oral history, as street legend, as a narrative that serves to illuminate a role that was real even if the specific person filling it cannot be fully confirmed. But the absence of documentation around her is not, on its own, evidence that she did not exist. It is, in fact, precisely consistent with the operational logic of what she was supposedly doing. Someone whose value to a drug organization lay entirely in her invisibility to law enforcement would not be expected to appear in law enforcement records. Female operators were underrepresented in arrest records and court documents, not because they were less active, but because they performed functions that attracted less scrutiny. The supply chain logistics, the money handling, the training. These were the roles that kept organizations running between the visible moments of violence and street-level drug sales that drew police cameras and court filings. The absence of a paper trail is the most elementary indicator that an operation was working. Whether the specific details of Fannie Mae Chambers' story are confirmed or not, the role she is said to have played is architecturally real. The Four Corner Hustlers did expand to Mississippi. Canton did become the gang's first out-of-state headquarters. That expansion required operational knowledge to travel from Chicago to Mississippi. And the research on how that kind of institutional transfer happens through trusted individuals with direct access to founding leadership, moving along established migration corridors, delivering instruction in person to people who needed it, points directly to the kind of role that Chambers is said to have occupied. The Four Corner Hustlers that were still generating federal prosecutions in 2022 and 2026 in Chicago were not the same organization that Walter Wheat founded at Delano Playground in 1968. They were the product of decades of transformation, expansion, violence, leadership change, factional splintering, and organizational adaptation. But the foundational logic, the emphasis on hierarchy, on bloodline trust, on discipline as organizational glue, survived all of those transformations because it was embedded deep enough in the original structure that no single event or generation of leadership change could dislodge it. That is the mark of an institution, and the Four Corner Hustlers, for all the destruction they caused and all the lives they ended, were an institution in the most technical sense of that word. A structured system of practices and relationships that persists across time and across the people who compose it at any given moment. Fannie Mae Chambers, if the oral history is accurate, was the person who carried that institutional logic from Chicago to Mississippi and installed it in a new city. She was the vector of transmission. She was the reason that when Squinky Walker died in 1985, there was something in Canton that could survive him, because it was not built around him alone. It was built around the knowledge she had delivered, the procedures, the hierarchy, the operational discipline, the model that came directly from the organization's founding circle in Chicago. The teenagers who sat with her in Canton and learned what she taught did not go on to run informal street crews. They went on to build an organization that held for 30 years, that expanded to multiple Mississippi cities, that sent a caravan of cars from Chicago to bury its founder, and that was still producing court cases in the second decade of the 21st century. That is the legacy of what she taught. That is the measure of the instruction she delivered. She drove the road, she carried the knowledge, she left no paper trail, and Canton has been Four Corner Hustler territory ever since,